Hey guys, so today we're taking another break from books and book discussions, and we're going to be diving headfirst into the muddled waters of modern cinema. And my word, do we have a contentious one for you. I've brought Jenna back onto the podcast to actually discuss it because it's been something that's weighing on her lately and she wants to get some things off her chest. So thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me again. I'd actually been wanting to talk about this movie for a while and just kind of get some of my thoughts out there about it because there is a lot to talk about here.
Oh, darling, where do I even start? I'll be honest, I thought Miller's Girl was, how do I put this gently, absolute rubbish, overly pretentious, poorly written, and completely devoid of meaningful character arcs. It felt like someone's uni dissertation that got far too much funding.
Harsh start, but fair play. I'll admit the script wasn't perfect, and I'm not here to say it's the next Citizen Kane, but rubbish? I wouldn't go that far. There's more nuance to it than you might think.
Well, let's start with the obvious. For one, Jonathan Miller, the teacher and arguably the main character of the story, bland as unsalted porridge. I mean, what's his motive? What drives him? Did even you know?
Jonathan's character does feel underdeveloped, I'll give you that, but I'd argue his blandness was intentional. He's meant to be a cipher, a kind of blank canvas for the audience to project onto. That said, I do wish we'd have more time to explore his psyche. There were scenes that got cut, scenes that might have given him more depth.
Okay, so these deleted scenes might help add some context. Tell me, why weren't these scenes included in the first place? Surely a film with such lofty ambitions wouldn't sacrifice narrative cohesion for a runtime or anything like that.
So, with festival films, which this was originally entered into the Palm Springs Film Festival, often face tough cuts, time constraints, pacing concerns. It's a bit of a balancing act. Believe me, as someone who's lived through every take, there was a fuller story in there, but compromises had to be made. It's just part of the business sometimes.
I suppose that does explain why the movie's pacing did feel a little off, and honestly kind of confusing at times, but let's pivot. Cairo's Sweet, your character. She's meant to be this enigmatic prodigy, but she comes across as a caricature. Were you given any backstory to work with, or were you just told to be pretty smart and capable, or what was the deal there?
It's funny you say that. Cairo was written to be enigmatic, sure, but I did have a backstory in mind. She's a young woman grappling with her own power, her own identity, as with most students and young adults. I try to bring those layers to the performance, even if they didn't all make it to the final cut. It's subtle, but I feel it also makes her more relatable as well. I wanted her to feel real.
I'll concede that your performance had its moments, but overall the film's message, if there even is one, gets lost in its own self-importance. What exactly was it trying to say?
That's a tough one. I think it was less about delivering a clear message and more about provoking thought. It's messy, sure, but life is messy. The film wanted to explore gray areas, moral ambiguities.
And ended up saying nothing at all. Listen, I'll give you credit for sticking up for this train wreck, but let's address the elephant in the room. The power dynamics. It's clearly trying to explore them as problematic in relationships, but it also, dare I say, empathizes with them. That's dodgy territory.
It's dodgy, sure, but it's also very real. Power imbalances exist in so many relationships, and I think the film was trying to navigate that without outright condemning or condoning it. It's about the complexity of human emotion. What happens when attraction meets power dynamics? Books like Lolita or films like Call Me By Your Name have explored similar themes. It's layered, nuanced conversation.
So, Lolita is a novel that dives headfirst into the taboo. A middle-aged man obsessed with a young girl. It's disturbing, but Nabokov's prose forces you to confront the character's depravity, while also showing you how obsession warps reality. Call Me By Your Name examines an age gap relationship, but in a more consensual and romantic light. That film explores the bittersweetness of first love and self-discovery. Both tackle power dynamics, but with entirely different outcomes.
Lolita condemns while making you understand the depths of obsession, and Call Me By Your Name humanizes a relationship that's unconventional but still consensual. Miller's Girl tried to sit somewhere in between. It's not as poetic as Nabokov's work and doesn't romanticize like Call Me By Your Name, but it does attempt to show the messiness of these dynamics without prescribing a moral conclusion.
But that's precisely where it fails, isn't it? It doesn't commit to either condemnation or empathy. Instead, it wallows in ambiguity, leaving the audience confused rather than enlightened. Take Dangerous Liaisons, for instance. That film explores manipulation and power to devastating effects with clear consequences. Miller's Girl skirts around consequences altogether.
I don't disagree. The narrative could have gone deeper, but I'd argue it still opens the door for these conversations, like the one we're having now. Isn't that a win in itself?
But discomfort can't be the only metric for success. These dynamics have real-world consequences, and I'm not sure the film grappled with that responsibly. Compared to something like The Reader, it addresses the consequences head-on.
But I think Miller's Girl wanted to reflect the uncertainty, the unresolved nature of real life. Not every story ties itself into a neat bow, and maybe that's okay, even if it's frustrating.
But whether it's okay or not, it's certainly given us plenty to talk about. I also found myself rather confused about the ending, and I'm sure a lot of other people did too. That final scene, a stare-off between Miller and Cairo. What on earth was that? After everything Cairo does to destroy him, why end on that moment? What does that mean?
Well, that's just a million-pound question, isn't it? I think the stare-off, like the rest of the film, is meant to be ambiguous, to leave the audience questioning their dynamic. Does she feel regret? Triumph? Does he feel defeated? Or is there a flicker of understanding? It's deliberately open-ended.
But open-ended to what end? It's absolute maddening. After everything, we're left with no closure, no indication of what happens next. It feels like a cop-out, a way to avoid committing to a resolution.
I get that, but maybe that's the point. Their relationship is so fraught, so layered that tying it up neatly would feel dishonest. The stare-off is a culmination of everything: resentment, power, vulnerability, maybe even a twisted respect. It forces the viewer to sit with their discomfort.
Or it just forces the viewer to write the ending themselves, which isn't exactly satisfying and feels lazy on behalf of the writers. Compared to something like The Graduate, that ending stare, ambiguous, yes, but it also captures the full spectrum of human emotion, the euphoria and doubt of life-changing decision. It's a commentary on the characters' arcs.
I think Miller's Girl wasn't aiming for that kind of commentary. It's more about leaving threads loose to reflect life's messiness. Maybe it's not satisfying, but it's thought-provoking in its own way.
Thought-provoking or not, it left me annoyed, but I suppose that's what some filmmakers want, innit? To irritate their audience into submission and just call it art.
I'd argue that it's definitely about leaving things open-ended. The stare-off between Miller and Cairo, well, it's rich with subtext, isn't it? Miller's been destroyed, but there's still this lingering tension. It's almost like a challenge.
A challenge? She's ruined him. The power dynamic's been flipped entirely. What possibly could be left to explore?
And maybe that's the point. The power dynamic's flipped, but it's not yet resolved. Their relationship, toxic as it was, wasn't just about power. There was a mutual fascination. Maybe these stares suggest that even after everything, there's something neither of them can let go of. Or maybe it's Mr. Miller realizing that it's too late, and he's underestimated what she's capable of, and he's grappling with the reality of the situation he's landed himself in through his own actions.
So you're saying it's symbolic, that this ending is supposed to leave us questioning their motives and lingering emotions?
Exactly. I'm not saying it's satisfying, because it's not, but it's compelling in a way that's almost primal. It's unsettling because we don't get closure, and neither do they.
That would have been nice, but instead we're left with, what, an uncomfortable stare and credits rolling to some haunting piano piece? I just can't help but feel cheated.
And I get that, but perhaps the lack of resolution mirrors the themes of the film. Power dynamics, forbidden attraction, they're messy. There is no neat bow to tie it all up in. The ending reflects that chaos.
But would it have killed them to hint at something more definitive? Did Miller walk away with a slap on the wrist, or does he spiral into guilt and his entire life is just in ruins?
Maybe the filmmakers didn't know either. Sometimes ambiguity isn't just a choice, it's a compromise.
Fine, I'll give it this. It's a bold move to end a movie that way, but bold doesn't always mean brilliant.
And I totally agree, and I think it's okay to feel frustrated. Art should provoke discussion, even if it's to say, this didn't work for me.
Well, you've certainly given me a lot to think about. Maybe I'll give it another watch, if only to spot more things to complain about. Thank you so much for being here.
I suppose I can take that as a win. Thank you so much for having me on and letting me talk about this.